Different origins and creators. Unlike virtually every other speaking race in Middle-earth, elves and dwarves had fundamentally different origins that set them at odds from the very beginning. We are told in the Silmarillion that the elves were the firstborn children of Ilúvatar himself. Eru created them directly as part of his grand design for Arda, giving them immortal life bound to the world until its ending. And indeed, the elves were meant to awaken first among all the speaking peoples. The dwarves, however, came into being through an entirely different process. Aulë the smith, one of the Valar, grew impatient waiting for the children of Ilúvatar to awaken, and so he fashioned the seven fathers of the dwarves in secret, teaching them the language he had devised for them, which became Khuzdul. Ilúvatar discovered this unauthorized creation and initially rebuked Aulë for attempting to usurp the creator's power, for Aulë could not grant true independent life to his makings. They moved only according to his will, like puppets responding to their master's thought. Only when Aulë humbly repented and raised his hammer to destroy the dwarves did Ilúvatar take pity and grant them true life, adopting them as his children, though warning that strife would arise between dwarves and elves in the future. Because Ilúvatar had decreed that the elves must be the firstborn, he commanded that the dwarves be laid to sleep until after the elves awakened. Thus, from the very moment of their creation, the dwarves were defined as secondary, as adopted rather than true children, as beings who had to wait for the elves. This fundamental difference in origin meant the two races viewed themselves and each other through vastly different lenses. The elves often carried an air of superiority as the legitimate firstborn directly created by Eru, while the dwarves developed a fierce pride in their own separate identity forged by Aulë the Maker. And indeed, the dwarves venerated Aulë as their creator and called him Mahal. The theological implications ran deep. The dwarves lacked the immortality of elves and were bound to different fates after death according to their own beliefs, and they possessed a nature more aligned with the substances of Arda itself, given Aulë's dominion over rock and metal, and the earth's very bones. Hunting petty dwarves. But the hatred between elves and dwarves didn't truly ignite until actual contact occurred in Beleriand during the First Age, and that first contact was catastrophic beyond measure. The Petty-dwarves, or No-Gith Niben in Sindarin, were dwarves exiled in ancient times from the great dwarf cities of the East for reasons never fully recorded, possibly for evil deeds, and they were the first of their kind to cross the arid Luin into Beleriand, long before the elves arrived there. They established settlements including Nolokit's Den, which would later become Nargothrond, and Sharbhund at Amon Rud, and being masterless and few in number, they found it difficult to obtain ore and their smithcraft dwindled, while they themselves diminished in physical stature, becoming smaller than their eastern kindred. When the Sindar first arrived in Beleriand, they encountered these petty dwarves, but did not recognize them as speaking beings at all. The Eldar had never seen dwarves before, and caught only fleeting glimpses of these strange creatures in darkness or dim light. The petty dwarves had a tendency to attack elves by stealth at night, or ambush solitary travelers in wild places, and so the Sindar concluded these were simply a species of cunning two-legged animals dwelling in caves. We read in Tolkien's essay Quendi and Eldar that the elves therefore called them Levain, Taddale, meaning animals with two legs, or simply Taddale, and they hunted them accordingly, shooting them with arrows, trapping them, killing them as one might hunt dangerous beasts. This continued until the dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod established contact with the Sindar years later, and the terrible truth was revealed. Those animals the elves had been hunting and slaying were actually speaking people, fellow incarnates with language and culture. The shame and horror of this realization led the Sindar to give the petty dwarves proper names like Niben Nogrim, but the damage was catastrophically done. The petty dwarves came to hate all elves with an unquenchable passion, especially the Noldor, whom they saw as usurpers who later took their lands when Finrod built Nargothrond in their ancient halls. By the time of the Wars of Beleriand, the petty dwarves had nearly died out. Only Mim and his two sons remained at Amon Rod in the late 400s of the First Age. But their hatred endured and would have terrible consequences, for Mim betrayed Turin Turambar to Morgoth orcs and later placed a powerful curse on the treasure of Nargothrond that contributed to the downfall of Doriath itself. Thingol's murder, the single most catastrophic event that transformed simmering tensions into outright war and multi-generational hatred, occurred in FA 502, when dwarves from Nogrod murdered Elu Thingol, the greatest of the Sindar and Lord of Beleriand, inside his own treasury in Menegroth. The background was complex. Hurin Thalion, driven mad by Morgoth's curse and manipulations, had brought the Noglamir to Thingol's halls, scornfully throwing it at the king's feet. This necklace was perhaps the greatest work the dwarves had ever crafted, originally made for Finrod Felagund by smiths of Nogrod and Belegost, with countless gems from Valinor set in gold, so cunningly that it weighed no more than a wisp of straw despite its magnificence. The necklace had been part of Glaurung's hoard in ruined Nargothrond and carried Mim's terrible curse. Thingol, who by this time possessed one of the Silmarils recovered by Beren and Luthien from Morgoth's crown, conceived the desire to have these two greatest treasures united. He summoned dwarf craftsmen from Nogrod to set the Silmaril into the Noglamir. When the work was complete, and Thingol came alone to their forge to receive it, the dwarves beheld the combined beauty of their greatest work, now bearing a Silmaril, and they were filled with overwhelming lust to possess it. They refused to surrender it to Thingol, claiming the necklace rightfully belonged to them since their forefathers had made it for Finrod alone, and it had been stolen from Nargothrond. They demanded it as payment for their labor. Thingol understood well they merely coveted the Silmaril, and he answered with deadly scorn, asking how they of uncouth race dared demand anything of him. Elu Thingol, Lord of Beleriand, whose life began by the waters of Cuiviénen, ages before the fathers of the stunted people were even created. He commanded them to leave Menegroth without payment for their insolence. The dwarves, enraged by his contempt and consumed by their desire for the Silmaril, fell upon Thingol and slew him where he stood among them. Thus died the only Sindarin elf who had looked upon the light of Valinor, murdered by dwarven hands over a piece of jewelry. The rest of the dwarven party was hunted down and killed by avenging elves as they fled, and the Noglamir was recovered, but two escaped and returned to Nogrod, where they told a false tale. They claimed Thingol had refused payment and murdered their kinsmen to cheat them of their rightful wages. Sack of Menegroth. What followed Thingol's murder guaranteed that elves and dwarves would carry mutual hatred for thousands of years hence. The dwarves of Nogrod, inflamed by the lies of the two survivors, gathered a great host for vengeance, while the dwarves of Belegost refused to aid them in what they saw as an unjust war. The army from Nogrod marched west through Beleriand in Fa. 503, and they found Doriath utterly vulnerable. Melian had departed Middle-earth in her grief, taking the girdle of Melian with her, and the realm that had been protected by her power for thousands of years now lay open to attack. Many of the Sindarin captains were scattered and demoralized by the loss of both their king and queen. The dwarves entered Menegroth, and a grievous battle raged in the Thousand Caves, with heavy losses on both sides. Mablung of the Heavy Hand, who had served Thingol since the first rising of the sun, was killed defending the treasury where the Noglamir lay. The dwarves emerged victorious, slaughtering many elves and plundering Thingol's treasures, including the Silmaril. As they marched homeward laden with stolen wealth, Baron Urchamian received word of the calamity and led a force of green elves and Ents to intercept them at Sarn Athrad, where the dwarf host attempted to cross the river Ascar. The dwarves were ambushed and destroyed almost to the last. Beren himself slew the Lord of Nogrod and reclaimed the Noglamir from him, though the dying dwarf lord cursed all the treasure they had taken from Doriath. The remaining gold and jewels were cast into the river, which thereafter was called Rathloriel, the Golden Bed. This sequence of betrayal, murder, sack, and slaughter created wounds that would never heal. The Sindar would remember that dwarves had killed their greatest king and desecrated Menegroth for greed, while the dwarves would remember that an elven host with Ents had destroyed an entire army, and that an elven king had shown them nothing but scorn and contempt for their race. Generations later, when disputes arose between Thranduil's woodland elves and Thorin's company in The Hobbit, the narrative explicitly states the elves accused dwarves of stealing treasure, while the dwarves claimed elves had cheated them of proper payment, echoing exactly what happened with Thingol and the Nogrod craftsmen more than 6,000 years earlier. Language secrecy. Beyond violent historical conflicts, a persistent source of mistrust and resentment between the races was the dwarven practice of keeping their language completely secret from all outsiders. Khuzdul, the tongue created for the dwarves by Aulë himself, was considered by them to be uniquely sacred. It was a language isolate, unrelated to the tongues of elves or men, with structure based on triconsonantal roots that sounded utterly foreign to elvish ears. The dwarves taught Khuzdul to their children as a learned language rather than a cradle tongue, preserving it with such care that it changed remarkably little over thousands of years, remaining closer to Aulë's original form than even the most conservative elvish dialects remained to their roots. But here's what rankled the elves especially. The dwarves would willingly learn Quenya, Sindarin, or later Westron to communicate with other races, becoming multilingual out of practical necessity, yet they absolutely refused to teach Khuzdul to outsiders regardless of friendship or alliance. Indeed, the dwarves were so secretive about their language that they would not even reveal their true Khuzdul names to other peoples, instead adopting outer names in the languages of those they dwelt among. Thus, names like Thorin and Gimli are actually northern Mannish names, not their real dwarven names, which remained known only to other dwarves. This linguistic secrecy extended even to the dead, for dwarven tombs recorded only their public names rather than their true ones. The only Khuzdul widely known to outsiders was their battle cry, Baruk Azad, Khazad I Menu, meaning axes of the dwarves. The dwarves are upon you. The dwarves possessed even a secret sign language called Iglishmek, consisting of subtle, swift gestures that other races could hardly detect, let alone interpret, and they were no more willing to teach this than their spoken tongue. To the elves, who generally shared their languages freely and delighted in linguistic creation in exchange, this absolute secrecy felt like fundamental mistrust. The dwarves were saying through their silence that other races could never be trusted with the most intimate aspect of dwarven identity. Some Noldoran lore masters were eventually allowed to learn enough Iglishmek to understand it, but this was a rare exception, and even then the dwarves gave up their linguistic secrets grudgingly. Samwise Gamgee's comment that Khuzdul must be a fair jawcracker reflects the general outsider perspective that Dwarvish was harsh and difficult, though whether this was objectively true or simply because so few ever learned it remains unclear. This language barrier wasn't merely practical, it was symbolic of a deeper unwillingness to fully open their society and culture to the other free peoples. Beyond specific incidents, elves and dwarves simply approached the world in ways that generated persistent mutual irritation and incomprehension. The dwarves were intensely focused on craft, on making things of permanence from the bones of the earth. Their halls were carved from living rock, their treasures were metal and stone and gems, their very bodies were made by Aulë to be strong and unyielding and resistant to domination. They valued things that lasted, that could be possessed, that had weight and tangibility. The elves, especially the high elves who had seen the light of Valinor, cared more for beauty itself than ownership. They delighted in starlight and song, in growing things and flowing water, in poetry and memory. We read that Aulë took delight in the deed of making and in the thing made, but neither in possession nor in mastery. Yet the dwarves descended from him had certainly come to care greatly about ownership, about treasure, about guarding what was theirs in deep vaults. This made them seem grasping and greedy to elven eyes, while from the dwarven perspective the elves appeared impractical and frivolous, more concerned with aesthetics than substance. The dwarves' tendency toward what Tolkien calls gold lust, their susceptibility to overwhelming desire for precious things which could drive them to rash and terrible acts, was viewed by elves as a fundamental character flaw, a dangerous instability in dwarven nature. Yet the dwarves would counter that elven pride and sense of superiority was equally dangerous, that the Noldor's pursuit of the Silmarils had brought far more ruin to Middle-earth than any dwarven treasure hunger ever had. The dwarves lived in isolation in their mountain halls, emerging mainly for trade and warfare, keeping themselves to themselves. They were described as somewhat shorter than men on average, with their dwarf women so rarely seen abroad that other races sometimes believed dwarves simply sprang from stone. This isolationism and cultural secrecy frustrated elves who were more cosmopolitan and interconnected, even in matters where they cooperated successfully, such as when dwarfs helped carve Menegroth for Thingol or built the doors of Durin for Eragon. There remained an underlying tension about proper credit, proper compensation, proper respect. The dwarves felt the elves looked down on them as lesser beings, as the adopted children rather than true firstborn, and they weren't entirely wrong in this perception. Celeborn's grudge, individual elves could also perpetuate ancient grudges across millennia given their immortality, and few examples are more striking than Celeborn's enduring distrust of dwarves lasting from the First Age into the Third. Celeborn was a kinsman of Elú Thingol, and although his precise role in the events following Thingol's murder is never detailed, he certainly lived through the catastrophe that befell Doriath when dwarves slew his kinsman and sacked Menegroth. This personal connection to the tragedy meant Celeborn carried deep anger and suspicion toward all dwarves for the rest of his exceedingly long life. We're told explicitly that even though he and Galadriel helped found Eragon in the Second Age around SA 700, partly due to Galadriel's sympathy toward the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, Celeborn himself would not enter the dwarven mansions despite the friendship between Eragon and Moria. When Galadriel later departed Eragon to take up rule in Lorien and she crossed through Khazad-dûm, but Celeborn refused to pass through the dwarven realm due to his enmity and remained behind in Eragon where he was largely disregarded by Celebrimbor. Even thousands of years later, during the War of the Ring, when the Fellowship arrived in Lothlorien in TA, 3019, Celeborn initially welcomed Gimli despite his distrust of dwarves, expressing hope that friendship might be renewed between their peoples. But when he learned that Balin's expedition to recolonize Moria had awakened Durin's bane, and that this Balrog had attacked the Fellowship resulting in Gandalf's fall, Celeborn's ancient anger blazed forth immediately. He declared he regretted allowing the Fellowship to enter Lothlorien at all if this was the result of dwarven folly, essentially blaming all dwarves for the disaster. Galadriel had to intervene to soothe her husband, and he apologized to Gimli, but the incident revealed how close to the surface his old prejudices remained. Over 6,500 years after Thingol's death, Celeborn still viewed dwarves through the lens of that ancient betrayal. His case demonstrates how elven immortality could preserve grudges and perpetuate interracial conflicts across ages when the original combatants remained alive to remember and resent. Thranduil's imprisonment. The animosity didn't remain confined to ancient history, but actively flared again during the events of The Hobbit in TA 2941, when Thranduil of the Woodland Realm imprisoned Thorin Oakenshield and his company without proper cause, an act that would directly influence Legolas and Gimli's initial hostility when they met decades later. When Thorin and his companions were traversing Mirkwood, they ran out of food and attempted to join elvish feasting they discovered in the forest. But the elves repeatedly thwarted them and eventually captured Thorin, bringing him before Thranduil. The Elven King interrogated him, but Thorin refused to reveal the purpose of their journey or their interest in the Lonely Mountain. We're told Thranduil actually guessed their intent to reclaim Erebor from Smaug, but when Thorin wouldn't speak openly, Thranduil had him locked in his innermost cells. When the remaining 12 dwarves were subsequently captured, they fared no better, being thrown into the king's dungeon to join Thorin. The narrator explicitly tells us the Wood Elves did not love dwarves and recounts that in ancient days they had had wars with some of the dwarves, whom they accused of stealing their treasure, while it is only fair to say that the dwarves gave a different account and said that they only took what was their due, for the Elf King had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. This directly echoes the Thingol situation. Accusations of theft versus accusations of non-payment, with both sides claiming the other had violated their agreements. Thorin's family, being Longbeards of Durin's line, had nothing whatsoever to do with these old quarrels, yet they suffered imprisonment anyway, demonstrating how collective racial prejudice operated. The company would eventually escape through Bilbo's cleverness with the magic ring, floating away in barrels through the Forest River, but the experience left deep resentment. When Gimli, son of Glóin, later encountered Legolas, son of Thranduil, at the Council of Elrond, there was immediate friction explicitly because Glóin had been among those imprisoned by Thranduil. Gimli carried his father's grudge about the rough treatment they'd received, while Legolas presumably had heard his father's version of events painting the dwarves as secretive troublemakers who'd stumbled into Mirkwood on some dubious quest. Their eventual friendship during the Quest of the Ring was genuinely remarkable and rare, precisely because it required both of them to overcome not just ancient racial tensions, but fresh personal family grievances from recent memory. Mim's curse. Finally, we must consider how curses and evil influences perpetuated hatred, even when individuals might have sought reconciliation. For Mim, the petty dwarf laid a powerful curse upon the treasure of Nargothrond that indirectly but certainly contributed to Thingol's murder and thus to all the subsequent strife. After Turin slew Glaurung, Mim returned to Nargothrond and claimed the dragon's hoard as his own, asserting ancient petty dwarf rights to those halls. When Hurin arrived seeking the treasure, Mim warned him it was trebly cursed, by the dragon's breath, by the blood spilled in its taking, and by Mim's own curse upon it. Hurin slew Mim but could not lift the curse. When Hurin brought this accursed treasure to Thingol, Melian warned him that evil hung over it beyond what even she could perceive. Yet Thingol's desire for the Noglamir and the Silmaril proved stronger than wisdom. In various versions of the tale, the curse's mechanism differs, but its effect remains constant. Unnatural covetousness, deadly pride, violence between those who should be allies. The Noglamir, which had been the dwarves' greatest artistic achievement, became an object that brought only death to Thingol, to the dwarven craftsmen who worked on it, to thousands who fell in the battles that followed, and eventually to Dior when the Silmaril passed to him. Some dwarves later explicitly justified their claim to the treasure by arguing it had been taken with violence and murder from a dwarf, meaning Mim, even though Mim was not truly kin to the dwarves of Nogrod at all, but rather of the despised petty dwarves. This shows how grievances could be adopted and weaponized regardless of actual relationship. The curse serves as a dark metaphor for how hatred itself acts as a curse. Once Mim, in his bitterness and pain at being hunted and persecuted by elves, laid his dying curse upon treasure. That curse perpetuated itself through generations, turning elves and dwarves against each other again and again, making reconciliation nearly impossible because each new act of violence could be justified by referencing previous ones in an endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge, stretching back to that original sin of the Sindar hunting the Petty-dwarves as animals all those ages ago. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe to see more content like that.